Hello, my name is Angela Ho. I teach early modern European art history at Georgetown University. I'm delighted to participate in this program and would like to thank Georgetown Summer Teacher Institute for the invitation. In this talk, I will focus on how the trade in one type of crafted object, namely porcelain, impacted artistic practices of both Europe and China in the 16th and 17th centuries. I hope this case study will help us think about the theme for this year, the connected histories of the Renaissance. So let's begin with one of the prized possessions of the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., the Feast of the Gods. Giovanni Bellini, the preeminent Venetian painter of his generation, created this image of a divine party for Duke Alfonso d'Este of Ferrara in 1514. Now, scholars have studied Bellini's literary sources, the Duke's patronage, and later changes made by Titian. But what interests me for the purpose of this talk is less the interpretation of the subject or the identification of the figures than the presence of certain objects in the composition. So here, sitting in front of Poseidon and Amphitrite, is a large ceramic fruit dish. Its characteristic blue and white decorations indicating that this is Ming porcelain from China. Behind the seated gods, and Saturn and Nymph carry two more large porcelain serving dishes. So it is interesting that when the Venetian master imagined a scene of classical gods for an Italian prince, he should imagine the deities feasting from porcelain produced in Asia. It speaks to the elite status of the ceramic product in the early 16th century, its exoticism and preciousness, and its attractiveness to a princely audience. And Bellini was not the only prominent artist to include porcelain in a painting. Andrea Mantegna, Bellini's brother-in-law and the court painter of Mantua, depicted this adoration of the Magi at the turn of the 16th century. The biblical story of the three kings from the East had long given artists the opportunity to fill their pictures with exotic costumes and luxurious objects. Here, one of the Magi, Melchior, holds a Turkish censer, and on the right, Balthazar carries an agate cup. And in front of them, Caspar, the eldest king, presents the Christ child with a porcelain cup filled with gold. All three objects were seen as rare, valuable, and worthy as gifts for the Savior. Now, porcelain was indeed seen as something amazing when it first reached Europe. It had a white body, unlike the reddish clay tone of European earthenware. Porcelain was strong and resistant to chipping. The high-quality pieces, like the ones I'm showing you here, can be so thin that they appear translucent. What gives porcelain its luminosity, translucency, and strength is an ingredient called kaolin. The addition of this special type of clay resulted in a mixture that can be fired at very high temperatures. Kaolin also gave porcelain its distinctive white color. Now, Europeans would not crack this formula until the 18th century. Meanwhile, Chinese potters had been developing the technology since the 7th century, and archaeological records show that they had been exporting the products to East and Southeast Asia, as well as the Islamic world as early as the 10th century. On the screen is a dish made in the 14th century for the Islamic markets in Central Asia. Small quantities arrived in Europe via the Silk Road, which was a series of trade routes that linked China, Tibet, India, the Islamic kingdoms, and North Africa, and all the way to the Mediterranean. Porcelain items were hard to come by in Europe and therefore are very exclusive. The mystery surrounding the physical properties and the limited supply made porcelain a coveted collector's item in Europe. Porcelain objects were kept in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance in what we call the chambers or cabinets of curiosities. This is where aristocrats and the wealthiest merchants would house valuable and marvelous objects. This is Franz Franken's impression of one such chamber. Now, these pictures usually don't represent actual specific collections, but they do give us an impression of what collectors bought and displayed. So in this picture, a delicate porcelain cup sits on the table among exotic shells, gemstones, and objects of precious metal and antiquities. An imaginary depiction of a truly extravagant collection by the Flemish artists Rubens and Jan Bruegel serves as an allegory of sight. So the picture offers all the exquisite crafted objects that humans could appreciate through seeing. And on the left, on a table and shelf laden with pearls, gemstones, precious metal objects, are porcelain vases, dishes, and cups. The scholar Robert Finlay, who calls porcelain the pilgrim art, argues that it yields, I quote, the earliest and most extensive physical evidence for sustained cultural encounter on a worldwide scale, end quote. As such, it seems to be an ideal case study for examining the global Renaissance. For the rest of the talk, I would like to look at the artistic exchanges that emerged from the porcelain trade between China and the Dutch Republic, which began in the early 17th century. I choose to focus on the Dutch not only because that is my research specialty, but also due to the fact that the Dutch played a major role in bringing porcelain to a much wider audience in the 17th century. The influx of porcelain into the Republic, and then from there to the rest of Europe, transformed the trade. The growing volume of circulation also shaped artists' responses in both Dutch towns and in China. But the first to bring porcelain to Europe via maritime trade were the Portuguese. In the 16th century, they sailed around Africa and established trading posts in East Asia. So the blue lines on this map represents the Portuguese trade routes. They were able to import larger quantities of porcelain and more regularly to Europe, but their priority really was the trade in spices. So the Portuguese were still aiming at providing a limited supply of luxury goods like porcelain to an elite set of buyers in Europe. That changed when the Dutch entered the arena. The Dutch Republic, which did not even exist as an independent polity until 1609, was fast becoming an economic powerhouse. Within a few decades of freeing itself of Spanish control, it would be the trading and financial center of Europe. Much of the wealth came from their seafaring prowess, also ingenuity in finance. So through superior shipbuilding and navigation skills, the Dutch went all over the world, exploiting natural resources of colonized lands, acquiring important products not available in Europe, and yes, engaging in the slave trade. As you can see on the screen here in this map, the Dutch, like the Portuguese, sailed around Africa and set up a colony, a provisioning station in Cape Town, and from there to Asia. where they seized part of Indonesia and then went as far east as Japan. And then towards the west, they also went to South America and colonized part of Brazil. Now, the Dutch did not have a monarch to finance these very expensive and risky expeditions. So they needed to pull resources from various wealthy merchants and investors. The solution was to establish two companies of shared ownership, the West and the East India Companies. Now for our talk, we will focus on the Dutch East India Company, VOC for short, based on its Dutch initials. So the VOC was a joint stock company that raised capital by selling shares. It was chartered and backed by the States General, which was the main federal governing body. The States General granted the VOC a regional monopoly over Dutch commerce from West Africa to Asia. The goal was to dominate the Asian trade against European rivals, and to achieve that, the VOC was vested with governmental powers. It was authorized to arm warships and maintain troops. It could set up governors and governing councils in the colonized regions, and also it was authorized to conduct diplomacy with local rulers. And in 1619, the VOC seized Jakarta and set up their Asian headquarters there. Now again, the primary goal of the VOC was to wrest control of the spice trade from Portugal. And to that end, the Dutch set up trading posts on the Indian subcontinent and Indonesia, and often bullying local rulers into granting them favorable contracts for the spices. So again, they set up the headquarters in present-day Jakarta, a town that they renamed Batavia. And here is a painter's view of that colonial town. And you can see on the right there on the horizon, the heavily fortified castle built by the Dutch. But soon the Dutch also traded in Asian luxury goods in addition to the spices. So these goods include silks and textiles, very fine precious metal work, and lacquerware. These are all products that require specialized skills and materials that the Europeans lacked at the time. This list of goods also included porcelain. The story of the VOC's interest in porcelain as a commercial commodity began with a skirmish on the seas. So as part of the intense European rivalry playing out in South China Sea, the Dutch attacked Portuguese settlements and seized their ships. So in 1602 and 1603, the VOC captured 2 Portuguese ships, and they sold the loot in Middelburg and Amsterdam. The confiscated cargo included a good amount of porcelain objects, and the profits generated from the sale motivated the Dutch to import porcelain regularly rather than simply relying on piracy. Okay, so the VOC tried repeatedly to petition the Chinese emperor for the free trade rights, but the Chinese Empire, which had a very restrictive trade policy, rejected those requests. The VOC managed to establish a short-lived trading post in Taiwan, and they relied on Chinese merchants to bring goods there and also to Batavia. Now, even with those restrictions, the VOC scaled up the porcelain trade. By some estimates, the Dutch brought more than 40 million pieces to Europe between 1602 and the end of the 18th century. The increase in quantity also meant that the imported pieces varied greatly in quality. As you can see, the 2 jars on the right are thicker and coarser than the bowls and the bowl and the cup on the left. The decorations follow the trademark cobalt blue and white scheme, but the painting is much cruder and sloppy on those jars on the right. And by contrast, we find very delicate and detailed painting on the left. Now, what this means is that the VOC began selling objects of different grades at various price points. So porcelain as a general category of luxury commodity became a more common and accessible good in the 17th century Dutch Republic and from there in Europe. Now, thanks to the VOC's record keeping, we can quote unquote listen in on the discussions about the trade through the internal correspondence. As you can see here, I'm quoting from a letter from Batavia to Taiwan, and the official in Batavia says the porcelains found a ready market. Right? The liking for them increases in Holland and also in France. They were pleased that they were able to bring a good quantity of porcelain to Taiwan, as, in a quote, the demand in Europe is increasing daily. So you get a sense of the demand for the objects. So why did Europeans admire porcelain so much? To answer that question, we need to understand what kinds of ceramics were available in Europe before the arrival of porcelain. The main technique for producing finer wares was maiolica. You can indeed get very refined pieces like this plate decorated with classicizing putti, which are these winged infants, and the coat of arms of Pope Leo X. If you were not Leo X, you might be using items more like these. Common Dutch households were used to using these local earthenware. So it is no surprise that Chinese porcelain with this natural white color, rich blue decorations, and exotic imagery would be attractive to Dutch customers. Even the cheap plain type had physical advantages over local products in the sense that porcelain was thinner, impermeable, less likely to chip and crack, and easier to clean. But the Dutch fascination with porcelain was also part of their admiration for and curiosity about Chinese culture. For many in the Dutch educated classes, China represented a land of abundance and enlightened governance. There was a rising demand for knowledge about China, and this was reflected in the publishing industry in the 17th century. An author who actually went to China, he traveled with a VOC embassy to Beijing, was the Dutchman Johann Nieuwhof. His book would become a highly influential work about the Chinese Empire, not just in the Dutch Republic, but in Europe. Nieuwhof made drawings on his journey, which were embellished and made into engravings for that book. The frontispiece, which I'm showing you here, shows an imaginary seated portrait of the Chinese emperor, surrounded by officials and looming over vanquished enemies and prisoners. Nieuwhof's book was meant to provide authoritative descriptions of China's lands and peoples, although to the modern eye, the images are plain inaccurate. So for example, the view of the imperial court depicts architecture that is a strange mixture of traditional Chinese as well as classical Greco-Roman architecture. And there were also plates that purport to illustrate the inhabitants of the vast country. This page, for example, is supposed to represent Chinese men, as it was labeled there. It shows three figures dressed as court officials against a backdrop of this very fantastical castle. Okay. The artist also felt compelled, as you can see in the background there, to add palm trees to reinforce the exoticism of the scene. And that would not be a native tree in that part of China. Later authors would capitalize on this growing interest in all things Chinese and publish books that borrowed heavily from Newhoff's publication. I'm showing one example here. It's a book by a guy called Overt Daper, another Dutchman, but he never went to China. Right? In the absence of copyright laws, publishers and authors, not only in Amsterdam, but again all over Europe, recycled ideas and images across publications. And this repetition created this broad impression of Chinese culture in the European imagination. So to sum up so far, porcelain was a very attractive product to the Dutch because first, it was simply a superior product than what was made locally. Again, thinner, stronger, easier to clean. Second, as the Dutch became more and more interested in the world outside of their continent, the foreign appearance of the decorations satisfied this demand for novelty. And third, and this is related to the second point, porcelain was produced primarily in China, which, as I explained, was a culture much admired by the Dutch. So the question for us is, how did the growth and the porcelain trade impact the Dutch visual environment? In Vermeer's Hat, Timothy Brooke wrote, quote, "By the middle of the 17th century, a Dutch home was a house decorated with china," end quote. The very wealthy collectors devised highly elaborate wall displays, like the reconstruction I'm showing you here, with prized pieces mounted on these wall shelves. But according to inventories of private estates, even more modest households would have a few pieces of porcelain, albeit probably of the cheaper types. So how did the Dutch use porcelain? Right? Now it seems that what we might call middle class and upper middle class households, they would have pieces for daily use, but more valuable ones were kept for display. Now, we don't know the identity of the painter who made this picture, but it's been dated to around 1630, and it shows a comfortably appointed home, not the wealthiest. And you can see porcelain plates, bowls, and vases placed on top of that ledge above the wooden wall paneling. Now, paintings are not documentary records, but they can provide clues to real-life habits. And furthermore, according to other sources of evidence, such as those estate inventories, and also advice manuals on how to maintain your household, people indeed displayed porcelain in this manner. Another really interesting visual source from the period are dollhouses. Okay. One of the most famous of these dollhouses belonged to a woman named Petronella Ortman, and it is now in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. Now, despite the name, dollhouses were not toys for children, but instead a valuable art object in its own right. They were frequently furnished with handmade miniatures procured from different craftspeople. Here is a view into the formal kitchen of the dollhouse, which contains an array of porcelain objects placed in a glass-fronted cabinet at the back there. And just like in the painting, there are also pieces on top of that wall edge. Now, some of these miniature plates and cups could be made of colored glass to mimic the shiny surfaces of porcelain, but some were actually special ordered from China just for this purpose, to furnish these dollhouses. This is the sitting room in that same dollhouse. This time there are vases displayed on top of what looks like a Chinese or Japanese chest. And indeed, this became a common way of displaying porcelain vases in the period. Now, the anonymous painting and the dollhouse were only two examples among many of how Dutch artists responded to the introduction of this foreign luxury good into their visual culture. Porcelain are often included in Dutch portraits, as for example, in this depiction of a family by Peter de Hoek. De Hoek includes two porcelain vases. Again, just like in the dollhouse, they were placed on top of a large chest. Now, portraits were important means of projecting one's image to a society. So artists and patrons would have been very careful in deciding what to feature in these paintings. And fine porcelain was a means of communicating wealth and sophistication to viewers in the know. And not surprisingly, the still life painters were the ones who focused intensely on the distinctive visual qualities of porcelain. So for example, porcelain dishes hold pears, grapes, and olives in this painting from 1615 by the Haarlem-based painter Floris van Dijk. But the artist who frequently depicts porcelain and with great effect was Willem Kauff, who specialized in depictions of very expensive and exotic objects. Kauff is known for his ability to capture the way light reflects off different materials and textures. And here, the shiny surfaces of the silver platter and the wine glass contrast with the matte texture of the wool carpet and the translucent, juicy flesh of the citrus fruit. And in the middle of it all is a covered porcelain bowl, this one with molded figures in relief on the sides. And you can see how Kauff makes this luminous white object stand out from his trademark dark background. And in this 1663 painting, now in the Cleveland Museum of Art, Kauff captures the material properties of blue and white wide-rimmed bowl, incidentally a type made specifically for the Dutch market. And in particular, he paints the edge of that rim with thin brushstrokes that vary from a light blue to almost pure white, showing the sheen of porcelain as well as the really delicate thinness. So painters were clearly finding inspiration in the unique qualities of porcelain. But Dutch artists and artisans also responded to the influx of these fine ceramic products in other ways. As I mentioned earlier, porcelain didn't just have the cachet of being a Chinese import, but it had physical advantages as dining and drinking wares compared to local ceramics. Now that the VOC is bringing in greater quantities at more affordable prices, this almost decimated the existing ceramics industry. So some porters who stayed in the business turned to strictly utilitarian objects like plain tiles. Others, however, decided to develop a product to compete with Chinese porcelain. So in the industry's struggle to survive, Delftware was born. It got its name from Delft, the town where it really flourished. And nowadays, every other shop, it seems, in the touristy parts of Amsterdam is one selling Delftware. Okay? It has become basically a quintessentially Dutch product. But it started out as an imitation of Chinese porcelain. As I mentioned before, the Dutch did not have the knowledge to make true porcelain in the 17th century. So what did they do? They developed a product that resembled porcelain in appearance, but not in chemical properties. So first, they refined the clay mixture so that it was possible to make the vessels thinner and stronger. Second, they covered the reddish color of the earthenware with a white tin glaze to approximate the natural white color of porcelain. And finally, they painted the vessels with cobalt blue to match that familiar palette seen on Chinese imports. So on the right is a porcelain dish. This bears a standard type of decoration called crack that the Chinese made for export in the 16th and 17th centuries. It has a very distinctive format. So there is a central motif, usually an animal or a figure, in this case, a dragon. The rim of the dish or bowl is divided into alternating wide and narrow panels in which the painter put floral or Taoist motifs. On the left is a Delftware dish, and you can see the Dutch painter adopts that crack formula, putting a bird in the center and imitating the decorative elements of crack porcelain in the border. Now, the vast majority of Dutch people would not have understood the Taoist symbols that you find on Chinese pieces. So the artist here is simply filling the panels with stylized plants. Delftware potters made a variety of ceramic products, but a significant portion of the output were imitations of Chinese vessels. As you can see in the slide, they emulated some of the characteristic shapes and even tried to depict Chinese figures. And you can see the attempt at rendering Chinese figural motifs more clearly in this image. Art historians call these images chinoiserie. They're decorations made by Europeans that evoke Chinese motifs. Now, to be clear, Delftware objects were not forgeries per se. That is to say, they were not meant to pass as porcelain. Okay? Many of them were actually stamped with the insignia of the factories that made them. And instead, they were supposed to be a domestically made alternative. Now, this industry grew rapidly, especially after the supply of porcelain was interrupted in the middle of the 17th century due to the collapse of the Ming Dynasty in China. Regular trade only resumed in the 1680s when China was then under the rule of the Qing Dynasty. Delftware makers filled the gap in supply in the interim. Now, interestingly, Dutch potters didn't always just copy Chinese prototypes to make their chinoiserie vessels. Now, this lidded Delftware jar looks like it might be based on a Chinese model. The painter certainly emulates the calligraphic brushwork and the image shown there seems to be an Asian-looking deity, but a closer source is actually an illustration from Overt Daper's book on the VOC's embassies to Beijing. So this was one of those armchair travelers books that I mentioned earlier. So the potter is following an image of Chinese culture that was already filtered through a Dutch lens. And moreover, the imitation was not a one-way street. Okay, scholars have long pointed out that the porcelain China made for export was different from those for their own use. The Chinese were happy to follow drawings or wooden models supplied by European merchants. Here are two examples. Okay, so on the left is a porcelain beer mug decorated with Chinese landscape elements. Now, the Chinese did not drink beer, so they were following specifications to make an item that conformed to European dining and drinking needs. On the right is a newer, again, not a Chinese shape. Now, to modernize these combinations of Western shapes and Chinese material and decorations look rather incongruous, especially with the metal mounts that were later added in Germany and in the Dutch Republic. But these would have been appreciated for their exotic value in the 17th century. And in fact, the Chinese tried to decorate export pieces with European figures. Sometimes they were commissioned to do so, other times on speculation that they would appeal to these foreign buyers. But that's not what the Dutch wanted, according to the VOC documents. So again, I'm showing you another letter from Batavia to Taiwan. The headquarters official tells their trade office not to buy Chinese porcelain with Dutch-style decorations. And at the end there, the reason given was because the Dutch paintings on porcelain are not considered strange nor rare. Another letter 2 years later repeats that observation. Say, you know, the kinds painted with Dutch figures were not as much esteemed and in demand, right, as the ones with Chinese decorations. So what the Dutch wanted were decorations that were strange and rare. In other words, paintings unlike those found on local products. This might also explain why Delftware painters were trying to decorate their wares with Chinese-style paintings. So we have this really intriguing situation where artists in both the Dutch Republic and China imitated each other's products. Delftware makers looked at both Chinese porcelain and Dutch illustrated books to create an aesthetic of Chinese-ness for Dutch consumption. Meanwhile, the Chinese were quite content to adapt their craft to European tastes and usage. So on the left is a Delftware flower pyramid, which is a distinctively Dutch form. So just to explain, you are supposed to place one cut flower in each of the spouts on the sides there. The decorations are a mix of Western and chinoiserie motifs. Now, there's evidence that Delftware pieces like these were shipped to China as examples of Dutch needs and tastes, which the artists in China then followed. And so on the right is a miniature flower pyramid made of porcelain in China, decorated with the Chinese take on a familiar European motif, the puto, that nude infants that you regularly see in Western painting and sculpture. So the porcelain makers' creations like this were then imported into the Dutch Republic, where they were regarded as examples of authentic Chinese art and as sources for Dutch artists and potters. So what happened was therefore this cycle of creative imitation that happened at both ends of the porcelain trade. This process culminated in an intriguing episode in the 1730s when the VOC decided to create a line of porcelain exclusive to them to be made in China. They commissioned a Dutch painter named Pronk to come up with the designs. They shipped his drawings to the headquarters in Batavia, where the officials and Chinese intermediaries then contacted suppliers in China to have the designs realized in porcelain. You can see Pronk's drawing on the left and an example of a plate made on the basis of that drawing that came from China. Now, this process in itself was not new, But what was remarkable was that Prong's images were filled with Chinese-looking figures and motifs. And the artisans in China were asked to execute these chinoiserie designs made by Dutchmen. Okay. So the Prong porcelain was, in a real sense, a real kind of collaboration between cultures. When we study and teach art history, we often categorize works of art by period and region because we do need a way to organize the vast amount of materials. The Renaissance and Baroque are traditionally seen as strictly European phenomena, with the standard story of a movement starting in Italy to revive classical Greek and Roman culture. The reality was that the Renaissance was not such an autonomous development. From the start, there were different emphases all over Europe, and the classical past itself was often refracted through Islamic scholarship. So in this talk, I again focused on one example of how European visual and material cultures were influenced by their exposure to sophisticated creations from Asia. And in this effort, I'm joining many scholars working right now in rethinking the Renaissance in a global context and how histories are connected. So thank you for watching this presentation, and I look forward to discussing this material with you in August.
And I would like now to introduce Professor Angela Ho from George Mason University. Again, all of you have had her bios and have enjoyed her wonderful lecture. And so I would invite you to think about your questions and post them. We already have one hand up, and these others raise your hand so I can get a good cue going on here.
So, hi everyone. For whatever reason, I just show up as Angela on Zoom. It's missing my last name, so that's where I am. Hello. Nice to meet all of you. And I, well, apparently you have my bio, but I started out studying basically 17th century Dutch art with a focus on economics and collecting. And I have moved in my sort of second book project into the trade between China and the Dutch Republic, partly because, hey, I'm fluent in Chinese, I might as well use it, right? So, and I'm looking at this period, 17th, early 18th century. Some economic historians call it kind of the first age of globalization. And when we dig in, and like I said at the end of the video, we tend to sort of think of Renaissance as this very European thing. It's sort of the epitome of European high culture. It's all about revival of Greek and classical Roman art and culture. But actually, you know, even then, you know, there were, or even in the Middle Ages, there were a lot of communications and trade of goods and information between Asia, Africa, and Europe, and then of course, later on, the Americas as well. So my lecture was really based on what I'm doing right now, my own research, which is centered on, again, like the trade between the Dutch and the Chinese. And the one luxury good that trumped all others in terms of volume was porcelain. And so I decided to kind of make that, that one commodity the focus of the lecture. You know, seeing it's 40 minutes, we can't do everything. So I don't know whether I should just open it up to questions, or Susan?
We have two hands already up. Marina Forbes.
Actually, I'm so sorry because I raised my hand and I had a question to Karima, so that's why I don't want to interrupt anything. And my questions actually, if you want me to continue, was about the mask. And because in the Hermitage Museum we have the same technique of optical illusion, it might be a great segment on mathematics, kind of like would be probably nice to show that picture of a mask, and I feel like I'm intruding. I'm so sorry. And in the mask, when on purpose, the geometrical figures are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, which creates this additional optical illusion of height. And my second question was to Karima as Saint Sophia, Hagia Sophia, Hagia Sophia, and for 1,000 years it was a Greek or Orthodox cathedral. For 500 years it was a mosque. 100 years it was a museum. And I would love to hear your comments on the current situation when it's turning into mosque again, and reaction of President Erdogan on that, and all the Christian world, if when you have a chance, if you can comment on that. And I'm so sorry, my hand was raised before you.
Yeah, actually, I'm sorry. It was the evil timekeeper, because I wanted to make sure that Professor Ho had her 30 minutes. So perhaps we can table that question a little bit.
Yeah,
and
that could take an hour.
Right, and of course the political repercussions of that, and the whole issue of heritage sites. One thing you did say though, Maria, that's important, I think, is the effect of these designs, these very intense, complex arabesque designs, is the feeling of infinity, that they make these spaces not solid, not feel solid like solid walls, but they draw the eye out and up toward the infinity, which is itself, you know, an aspect of expressing the sacred. So Jean has her hand up, Jean Travolsi, for Professor Ho.
Yes, hello, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Dr. Ho, thank you for your lecture. I'm married to a Dutchman and they're very practical.
Yes,
And
they are.
he pays his bills on time, everything is just so. I want to tell you that it was so interesting for me to hear how the Dutch people love that porcelain, because it was easy to clean, it didn't chip.
Mm-hmm.
It was beautiful, you could see through it. So the practicality of that very much interested me. When we go to parties at the ambassador's home, you will see on S Street Northwest, full of porcelains from China.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're the real thing. I mean, I think they're really old. But what I noticed is I think they're Chinese. But what I noticed was they look like they held the bulbs of tulips. It's not a flower pot, but have you ever seen something with like 4 arms extended with like, it looks like it could hold an egg, but I think they're tulip bulbs. They were showing off their bulbs. I mean, I don't know. Have you heard of anything like that?
Yeah, and I think I actually, let me just, let me see if I know how to do this. I usually use Blackboard, so I'm hoping
Yeah,
that
you can just share your, yeah, it's working, it's working.
Okay, let me just scroll down. I use lots and lots of slides, as you can see in my classes, usually. That's what I wanted to do. Okay. So it's not exactly like this, but I know it looks a little bit like a candelabra, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yes, so these kind of strange looking things. This is a Delftware piece. And hopefully you can see actually these spouts, and you're supposed to put, you know, 1 cut flower or 1 bulb in each. I think I mentioned in the video what this started out as a very Dutch thing, because, you know, Dutch were known for their tulips, which came from Turkey actually, but that's a whole different story. But then we believe that they might have shipped something like this to China, to Dingdazhen, the town where they make porcelain. And the porcelain makers actually try to copy it. And that's another thing that I wanted to bring into my lecture, which is that it's not a one-way street, right? This copying is, the Chinese were also very practical people, by the way, and they think, well, let's see, what do our customers like? What's their taste? So they're looking at this, and I think it's what you saw is probably a variation of this. But yeah, it's probably a Dutch form that the Chinese picked up and made into porcelain.
Or perhaps the Dutch commissioned it, just like they commissioned
Yeah.
the little dishes for the dollhouse. That was commissioned by the Dutch, right?
Yes, yes. Although for the most part, something as specific as this is probably could be commissioned, but it also could be sort of the merchants, the Dutch and the Chinese, just talking to one another.
I see.
And say, hey, can you make a batch of this? Because the Dutch also were not able to gain a foothold in direct trade for a long time. So they had to work through intermediaries to buy their supplies. So the Chinese would bring the goods to Indonesia, where they had their colonial headquarters. And they have sort of a wholesale market there, and they will pick up their goods there.
Thank you. I have a second question, if I may. I'm fascinated by this clay, this white clay. Are you calling it kaolin?
Yeah, kaolin. It's just like a Chinese transliteration. Yeah, it's a special kind of clay. Yeah.
And so nobody could reproduce porcelain because, one, they didn't have the clay, and two, they didn't have the process. Is that correct?
So yeah, so the clay, that particular clay allows you to fire the mixture at a very, very high temperature. So I wrote it down. So the Chinese would have fired it at about 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. And the Europeans couldn't figure it out until the 18th century. I think it's like 1720s, when two chemists working in a German court finally figured out the chemical properties, and they were able to then reproduce it. And that's why it's this wondrous thing that they had to keep buying from China, because they didn't know how to make it themselves.
And so I believe they found a source of the kaolin in Ukraine or something like that. And then later on they found others. I think we have one in West Virginia, a place of it.
Yeah. Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
Question.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And with regard to the copying, also going into the science and technology section of Emergence of Renaissance, the Freer and Sackler galleries have a wonderful collection of Iranian and Chinese things from the earlier periods. I think here from the 9th and 10th centuries, where the same kind of exchange was going on along the overland Silk Road between, for Chinese porcelain makers producing goods for the Iranian market, Iranian writ large, the Persian-speaking market, and then copying forms, and then Chinese designs, and then the amazing story that the Freer-Sackler has called From Iraq to China, which talks about the movement of cobalt, when cobalt blue as a chemical for the color blue was done on tin glazed, ordinary, reddish or beige colored clay to make it look like porcelain, at least, or to provide a white ground for the designs. But then the cobalt reaches China, and the idea of using cobalt, and then meets up with this magnificent, translucent, high-fired clay, and just becomes like the most enormously important consumer good for centuries and centuries in all sorts of different ways. If you'd comment on that, perhaps.
Well, actually, the very typical kind of red, blue and white look, right, when we think of porcelain, that was probably developed by the Chinese porcelain makers for the Islamic market. And precisely because of the movement of the metal, the pigment. And they started out making things in that palette to appeal to the Islamic kingdoms and as well as Persia in the 9th, 10th, 11th century. And then the potters, and especially Iznik, they didn't know how to make porcelain, but they figured out how to use a tin glaze, which tin oxide, it's white. So they cover up, much like the Dutch did later on, the kind of reddish clay products that they make with a white glaze, basically. And then they use cobalt blue so that it looks like porcelain. And it's a very similar process that the Delftware makers in Delft, the Netherlands, use to make Delftware, which again now is seen as this quintessential Dutch products that you can't walk, 10 feet in Amsterdam without running into a shop that sells it. So it's very interesting how all these products kind of start out as actually imitations of something they saw and they liked, and then they made it their own, and then it became firmly associated with the new culture.
And that's a really interesting thing. I like to remind students about that exchange of trying to get white-based porcelain without having kaolin. The Iznik potters and some before them added quartz to the clay and made it white, which was an earlier technique that the Egyptians had done. For faience and things like that. And so this gave us dishwasher-proof stoneware. That's basically what it is. So,
for which we're all thankful.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because by this stage, the Dutch, so they were, like the really wealthy and well-educated Dutchmen, they were collecting the high-quality pieces. And they actually, some of them wrote about it, not so much in a treatise or anything, but they wrote to one another. And they would say that, yes, there are these kind of imitations out there, and they actually call it Persian ware, right? They know where it came from. And they said, but it's not porcelain, it's actually glass, because they think of the quartz in it. And it's the same kind of mixture material that you make glass from. And they actually, so they were making these fine distinctions. And some collectors, some connoisseurs actually say, well, another way you can tell whether a piece is genuine porcelain versus Delftware or Iznik ware is if you kind of hit it, it makes a sound. It makes this, very clear sound if it's porcelain. So they have all kinds of ways to make distinctions already in this period.
And that takes us to the presentation by Pamela Smith of the Columbia Making and Knowing Project. I don't know if they have the lab equipment to be, firing porcelain and playing around with that, but it comes to exactly that kind of investigation and the practical artisans, talking about their craft. I have two questions, Joan Brodsky-Shore and then Roshni. Joan, are you unmuted?
I wanted to point out just how grateful I am for some of the slides that you have, where you see the ceramics and the porcelain in the context of a painting or of a home, of a setting. I realize now museums usually have separate sections of ceramics where you don't see them in the context of, a period home or palace or whatever it is. And so I'd never before looked at a painting for the porcelain, and what it represented and showed about the people that used it. My question has to do with a sort of difficult topic that I'm trying to grapple with. And that's because at least at the school I work at, we struggle a lot with the idea of cultural appropriation. I read it about it, it's really a very new concept.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to use this new concept, in terms of a historical thinking about it. But on the other hand, I'm sort of struggling with the idea of Europeans admiring something and then taking it into their own art in a way that doesn't really show or reflect a deep understanding of what they're using or incorporating. But on the other hand, this period of history, it's not about appropriating from oppressed or colonial parts of the world, but great empires, great civilizations. So if you could just talk, I know I may not be very logical here, but I'm just trying to get at what makes something appropriation in this historical period. Is that a concept that doesn't belong? Or is this the beginning of something that becomes that? If you could just comment.
Sure, that is a big question. So it's really funny. I actually just wrote a conference paper about something like that, and it took me forever because it's a theoretically very complicated question. I think in today's culture, when you say appropriation, there's this very negative connotation to it nowadays, or I should say it has political charge, right? It's kind of about about exploitation almost. And there is some of that, right? If you look at modern arts as well, there's this endless debate about how museums still display, say, African art, and they inevitably link it back to like Picasso and what he made use of African art for. So I think in this period, you do have a sort of misunderstanding or lack of understanding of the cultural context or meaning or specificity of the goods that you're buying, or when I say you, I mean Europeans were acquiring, and I think I mentioned something like a lot of porcelain were decorated with Taoist symbols, for example, and the Europeans had no idea what they were. So I think it's good, when I'm imagining, what happens in the classroom, and I teach this stuff in my classroom too, to kind of make that clear. But also, and to sort of acknowledge it, right? That, yeah, I mean, that it is commercial, and they are trying to come up with this sort of exotic products to sell to Europeans. And a lot of them didn't really care how quote unquote authentic this stuff really is. And I think they do that, right, with cultures that they were able to dominate. European cultures were able to dominate, more vulnerable populations in Africa and Americas, and you do see the kind of looting and appropriation in that way, where then the goods were transported back to Europe and they were displayed in these cabinets of curiosities, right? That they were all just dumped in there, and this is the exotic non-European world. And then in other instances, you have something like this, and that's also part of the reason why this project appealed to me as a research project, which is that this doesn't fit into that neat colonial model, right? If anything, the Dutch tried and tried and tried to get China to cooperate with them. They tried to sort of intimidate them, and then quickly found out that, no, they're a very powerful empire. We couldn't actually fight them. And so you have, in this case, more of a sense of emulation, if you will. So I think it's not, I'm not really answering your question probably in terms of giving you a very clear answer for your students, but you know, these things are messy. And our historical perspectives also change. And I think that's a very useful thing to tell students as well, that, you know, they probably won't grasp it, you know, at their age, at this stage, but it's a good thing to say, hey, you know, maybe what I think now is not sort of applicable to all different periods. But yeah, I think in this case, I think that there are different ways that cultures meet and that they encounter each other and what and how they take from one another. So I think that that's the best I can do at this stage. But if you're interested, you know, by all means, send me an email and we can talk further.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Roshni has a question.
Sure. Good morning. Thank you.
Hey.
I had a question about the change from the Ming Dynasty to the Qing Dynasty and how that affected the porcelain trade,
Right.
if it affected it at all. And I think my question really revolves around how much influence did the you know, the governing structure of the empire have on the trade itself?
Yeah.
Or was it just more, you know, geared towards the local communities and the local merchants?
Yes, thanks for that question. I have a whole section about that, and I thought, nah, I couldn't fit it into my 40-minute video. So so China in this period had infamously restrictive trade policy. They were very distrustful of these foreigners. They called the Dutch the red-haired barbarians. Who were there and they make trouble and so they're very kind of, they don't want to allow them to do business directly in the Ming Dynasty already in the mainland of China. And the other thing is, so the Europeans were mesmerized by textiles, silks, lacquer, porcelain. And the Chinese were really not very interested in what the Europeans had to offer in terms of goods. What the Chinese wanted was silver. That's their form of currency. So that's what basically the Dutch had to pay. So they were able to kind of be based in Indonesia, the Dutch, and they were based there for another reason, which is that for spices, which was their primary goal, really. So the Chinese merchants would bring porcelain to Indonesia, Jakarta, basically, and the Chinese would buy and would pick and buy what they wanted from there. Now, when the Ming Dynasty collapsed in the 1640s, basically the trade ceased, not only because it was chaotic and people couldn't bring goods to Indonesia, but the town, Tingdechen, where they made porcelain, the kilns were sponsored by the imperial government. So once the government collapsed, that stopped, the production stopped as well. So there was a period of hiatus between 1640s and early 1680s when Delftware really rose to the top because there was this demand and no porcelain or very little porcelain was coming in. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, tried to fill the gap by going to Japan, but they couldn't get the same quantities and it was more expensive. So the people in Delft made this kind of imitation alternative product. And then the trade started up again in the 1680s when the Qing Emperor Kangxi adopted a slightly more open trade policy. And by that stage, then the Dutch learned more about kind of polychrome porcelain. So they now have more varieties, not just blue and white. So the trade kind of stopped in the middle, which actually allowed Delftware to really grow. And then in the 1680s, when trade opened up again, they had more access and also access to more products. Yeah.
Great.
I think that comes
It does.
for social studies teachers, that comes to a concept that's usually used to talk about developing countries, which is import substitution. It can just as well be applied much farther back in history as an aspect of early globalization. Yep. Katie Scorza has a question.
Hi. So I was wondering, I really enjoyed the discussion of how we often think about porcelain as being, for the Dutch, you know, exotic and so limited to the elites, but now we look at even people who are much less affluent having some porcelain. So I was just wondering if you could talk about porcelain within Chinese society. I think we always see examples of, like, you know, the most beautiful pieces that would be owned by the imperial family, but just how, you know, ubiquitous was it? Would every average peasant family have some porcelain, or were they using other, you know, does it have the same sense of eliteness within Chinese society?
Right. So I must admit I'm not an expert in the porcelain production on trade in China itself. But I think much like the situation in Europe after the Dutch opened up the trade, you will have, excuse me, the really peasant families, I think, would have to make do with, you know, earthenware, you know, very crude, basic products. And I think, you know, starting from the Ming Dynasty, when the middle class in China really blossomed, there was also this growth in luxury goods, and that town, the Jingdezhen, which made porcelain, they would make different grades of products, right? So they would have the imperial government would come in and take the pick of, you know, the production every year, and you have a certain quota that would be reserved for central government and the imperial family. And then you will have products that are not quite as refined for a middle class market. So it's sort of a little bit like much larger scale, but it's a little bit like the situation in Europe as well, where you have these really exquisite pieces made for, you know, foreign diplomacy, for princes and very wealthy oligarchs like Medici. And then you have, you know, low grade, middle grade products that middle class burghers can use both for practical purposes, but also as a little bit of a status symbol. You know, I also have porcelain. So that's kind of broadly what it would be like. But again, you know, I confess I haven't actually studied the sort of socioeconomic aspect of porcelain in China itself.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We have Maureen has a question. This will be the last question because our time is up with Professor Ho pretty soon. And I want to also introduce a tool for bringing some of this material into the classroom. Maureen?
Okay, I really loved your presentation. And I have a question. So Dutch people knew that they were using a Chinese product, right? So how did Dutch people talk about Chinese people? Or what sense was there of, what sense did they have of China as a place or of Chinese people?
So China was called, and I think it's in the Silk Thread reading, it's called the most abundant place in the world, right? So they knew it as this very ancient empire. They admired it. A lot of Dutch intellectuals actually wrote that that should be the model, right? They have this idea that it's very enlightened government with a meritocratic system of appointing officials. Um, it's rich. And so they actually, in the 17th century into, I would say, until the mid 18th century, it was a very, very positive, admiring view of China. And that's why also something like porcelain and silks, they had cachet, right? And not only that, oh, they are imports from an exotic land, but it's from China, this kind of, magical place in a way. And so that we know from, writings, there are lots and lots of books about China published. They also noted some kind of um, aspects that they see as kind of strange. Like they are very obsessed with Chinese torture methods, for example, for some reason. And of course, these are not Christians, so they were heathens after all. But they culturally, they had great admiration. What most of the people didn't have, unless you're a sinologist in this period, is a very specific understanding of the cultural systems. So they like the kind of visual signifiers of the Chinese culture, but they might not understand exactly what they were looking at. So I hope that kind of answers your question.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That was really rich, and both yours and Professor Alwaleed's. So what we have left in our morning session here is about 20 minutes. And I wanted to introduce a resource, so I can share my screen.
Do I have to stop sharing?
I did that already. Okay. This is in your folder. If you go to the syllabus for today, you will see the link to the National Gallery of Art Artistic Exchange, Europe and the Islamic World. But of course, you can see right here with a piece of Chinese porcelain, that's not all that it's about. This is based on the work of Rosamund Mack. Actually, she did the work of going through the National Gallery's collection on Renaissance painting and identifying objects of exchange that are pictured there. And so she redid some of the labels. So here's this evergreen resource like they create for educators that has the various captions that she put together. There's the painting that Karima referenced with the bishop or the official with his hand, cardinal, with his hand on the carpet, looking straight at the viewer. Here's another one. And so she's documenting these patterns and these objects that are actually painted, and which she identified in her book From Bazaar to Piazza as actually those objects were in the treasuries of the churches and various private patronage of the arts that those painters could actually look at and use. So there are some carpets in the Vatican and other treasuries that they were actually able to look at and model to put into their paintings to have that kind of detail. So we created a lesson plan that goes with it, which goes at the end. So what I would like to suggest you do, I put the link in for everybody here to the artistic exchange thing, but if you, you'll find it also, here's the syllabus. I think I'm still sharing, I hope. Are you seeing the syllabus here? So you'll see on day 4, one of the readings that I put up was for day 4, this artistic exchange. Right there, you can click on that link.
We're not seeing the syllabus, Susan. We're seeing the artistic exchange.
That's right, but that's okay. It's in the syllabus on day 4 as one of the readings. So what I'd like to do is to invite people, if you have a need to take a quick break. Otherwise, I'd like to put you in groups to take a look at that and just scroll through it and see how you might use it and how it resonates with the both presentations this morning by our art historians.